Have you ever considered how a speck of dust, an insignificant bit of nothing, can, given enough time and the right conditions, become a mountain? It sounds like a strange thought, especially when we're talking about ancient empires. But that's precisely how the story of Assyria begins. Imagine for a moment the vast shimmering expanse of Mesopotamia, not as the cradle of civilization we often picture, but as a wild, untamed land, a place where small groups of people, barely more than scattered families, scratched out an existence. We are talking about a time so far back that written records are as rare as a quiet teenager on a Saturday morning. But even then, in the nebulous mists of prehistory, something was stirring in the Fertile Crescent, something that would eventually coalesce into one of history's most formidable powers. The earliest whispers of what would become Assyria emerged not from grand palaces, but from humble settlements along the Tigris River, specifically around the ancient city of Ashur. Think of it as a small, unassuming town, perhaps a dusty crossroads, where nomadic herders and fledgling farmers traded stories and goods. Historians still argue whether the initial settlers were indigenous to the region or migrated from elsewhere. But what's clear is that these early communities were bound by the need for survival, by the constant struggle against harsh environments and even harsher neighbors. They weren't building empires yet. They were just trying to keep their livestock from wandering off and their crops from wilting under the relentless sun. The very name Assyria itself is a testament to these humble beginnings, rooted in the city of Ashur, which in turn was named after their primary deity, the god Ashur. It's almost quaint, isn't it? A mighty empire named after a single town and its patron god. It's like calling the United States New York City, because that's where some initial trading post was. Kind of takes the intimidating edge off, doesn't it? These early Assyrians, long before they had grand armies or even proper kings, were already developing traits that would define their later dominance. A fierce resilience born of living on a frontier, and a pragmatic adaptability. They learned to work the land, to irrigate crops in a land where water was both blessing and curse, and to build sturdy, if unglamorous, dwellings. They were, in essence, frontier people, tough and resourceful, and like any good frontier community, they quickly understood the value of defense. While we don't have detailed battle reports from this period, it was more about scuffles over grazing land than grand conquests. The necessity of protecting their modest gains must have instilled a certain martial spirit. It's not hard to imagine a farmer, tired of losing his sheep to raiders, picking up a spear and becoming something more than just a farmer. The real shift, the first subtle rumblings of a larger destiny, came with the development of trade routes. Ashur, strategically located on the Tigris, became a natural hub for goods moving between the Anatolian Plateau, modern-day Turkey, and the resource-rich plains of southern Mesopotamia. Picture caravans of donkeys laden with tin, textiles, and other precious commodities, snaking their way across dusty plains, their merchants haggling fiercely in makeshift markets. These weren't just commercial exchanges, they were cultural exchanges, bringing new ideas, new technologies, and a broader understanding of the world beyond their immediate riverbanks. It's a bit like how the internet opened up the world, but with significantly more sand and fewer cat videos. This early commercial prowess, this innate understanding of how to move goods and make a profit, would become a cornerstone of Assyrian power, even as their focus shifted from trade to conquest. Yet this nascent period was far from a golden age. It was a chaotic time, with power constantly shifting. Small city-states dotted the landscape, each vying for influence, each susceptible to the whims of nature and the incursions of migrating tribes. The concept of a unified Assyria was still a distant dream, more a collection of loosely affiliated communities bound by a common geographical origin and a shared patron god than a cohesive political entity. Historians still debate whether these early Assyrians were truly distinct from their Sumerian or Akkadian neighbors in the south, or if they were more of a northern offshoot, gradually developing their own unique identity through isolation and adaptation. Regardless, they were forging something new, something that would eventually stand apart from the civilizations that had risen and fallen before them. They were, perhaps unknowingly, laying the very first bricks of an empire that would one day cast a shadow across the entire Near East, a testament to how even the humblest origins can lead to the most extraordinary fates. From those humble beginnings, where dusty caravans were more common than conquering armies, a new era began to dawn, subtly at first, then with increasing clarity. We're talking about the establishment of what historians rather uncreatively, but accurately, call the Old Assyrian Empire. It wasn't an empire in the sense of vast territorial control that we might associate with later periods. Think more along the lines of a highly influential trading network that eventually necessitated a more formal political structure. If the first period was about simply existing, this one was about getting seriously, strategically rich. It's a bit like a small-town entrepreneur who starts selling homemade cookies, then realizes there's a massive market for their delicious treats across the state. And suddenly, they need a proper company, employees, and a distribution network. That's the Old Assyrian Empire in a nutshell. An economic powerhouse with political aspirations. The catalyst for this shift was the flourishing Assyrian trade with Anatolia, particularly with the land of Ganesh, modern-day Kultepe in Turkey. Imagine, if you will, the Assyrian merchants, often referred to as Karum merchants, establishing colonies, or Karu, in foreign lands. These weren't military outposts, not yet, but rather sophisticated commercial hubs, mini-Assyrias abroad. It's fascinating, isn't it, how global commerce often precedes global conflict. These merchants, with their sharp wits and even sharper accounting skills, became the true pioneers of this empire. They weren't just hawking wares, they were building relationships, establishing trust, and most importantly, creating wealth that flowed back to Ashur. The primary goods were tin, essential for bronze making, and textiles, which the Assyrians were incredibly adept at producing. They'd bring tin from distant lands, often from what is now Iran, and weave it into luxurious fabrics, then trade both in Anatolia for silver and gold. It was a complex supply chain, meticulously managed, centuries before anyone had even conceived of a spreadsheet. They were, in essence, the venture capitalists and international brokers of their day. and they were very, very good at it. This extensive trade network brought immense prosperity to Ashur, allowing it to grow from a modest town into a significant city-state. With wealth came the need for organization, for rules, and for a more defined leadership. This is where the early Assyrian kings, or Ishiak Ashur, meaning Viceroy of Ashur, begin to emerge from the historical fog. Unlike later, more absolute monarchs, these early rulers often shared power with a sophisticated city assembly. It's a concept that might surprise you, given Assyria's later reputation for autocracy. But in these early days, decisions, especially those concerning trade and justice, were often debated and decided upon by a council of elders and prominent merchants. It paints a picture of a society that, while hierarchical, also had elements of communal governance. Historians still argue whether this assembly had true legislative power or if it was more advisory, but its mere existence suggests a unique political landscape for the time, a blend of nascent monarchy and mercantile democracy. One of the most remarkable aspects of this period is the sheer volume of cuneiform tablets discovered at Ganesh, literally tens of thousands of them. These aren't just dry historical records. They're personal letters, business contracts, legal disputes, and even family quarrels. They provide an unprecedented window into daily life, allowing us to almost eavesdrop on conversations from 4 millennia ago. You can read a merchant complaining about a late shipment, or a wife chastising her husband for not sending enough money home. It's an intimate look at a vibrant, bustling society, and it makes you realize that, even then, people were dealing with the same annoyances and aspirations we face today. Except, they didn't have to deal with endless email chains or slow Wi-Fi. Lucky them. The stability and success of this commercial empire, however, were always contingent on maintaining peaceful relations along the trade routes. The Assyrians weren't primarily conquerors at this stage. They were facilitators. Their military might, while present, was largely defensive, aimed at protecting their valuable caravans from bandits or rival city-states looking to muscle in on their lucrative business. This was a calculated risk, of course. Imagine sending your life savings off with a caravan, hoping it doesn't get waylaid by some unsavory characters. They relied on a combination of diplomacy, strategic alliances, and, when necessary, swift punitive actions to keep the trade flowing. This period, roughly from the 20th to the 18th century BCE, truly cemented Ashur's position as a regional power, not through brute force, but through economic acumen and a surprisingly sophisticated network of international commerce. It was a golden age of entrepreneurial spirit, laying the financial and organizational groundwork for the more aggressive expansion that would come later. Just as the old Assyrian Empire was hitting its stride, bustling with the clatter of caravans and the chink of silver, a figure emerged from the historical shadows who would drastically reshape its destiny. This was Shamshi-Adad I, a man whose ambition and military acumen would temporarily transform Assyria from a mercantile powerhouse into a truly territorial empire. If the previous era was about making money, this one was about staking claims, drawing lines in the sand, and telling everyone else to kindly step aside. Imagine a shrewd businessman who, having cornered the market, decides he doesn't just want to sell the product. He wants to own the entire factory, the supply chain, and maybe even the land it sits on. That was Shamshi-Adad, and he was exceptionally good at it. Shamshi-Adad wasn't originally from Ashur. He was an Amorite, a semi-nomadic people who had been moving into Mesopotamia for centuries. This is a crucial detail, as it highlights a fascinating aspect of ancient history. Power wasn't always inherited directly, and sometimes the most impactful changes came from outside forces integrating themselves into existing structures. He wasn't some quiet inheritor of a dusty throne. He was a dynamic, ruthless, and highly intelligent outsider who seized opportunities with both hands. His rise to power around 1800 BCE wasn't a gentle succession, but a forceful takeover. He conquered Ashur itself, establishing his dominance over the very heart of the Assyrian trading network. It's a bit like someone taking over a major tech company by force, then using its infrastructure to launch a whole new, much larger enterprise. What set Shamshi-Adad apart was his clear vision for a unified, expansive kingdom. He wasn't content with just managing trade routes. He aimed to control the entire trade network, from the sources of tin to the markets in Anatolia and everything in between. To achieve this, he embarked on a series of relentless military campaigns. He conquered strategic cities like Mari on the Euphrates, a crucial hub for trade and communication, and then expanded north and west, pushing his influence across a vast swathe of northern Mesopotamia and parts of Syria. His realm became known as the Kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia, and for a brief, glorious period, it truly was an empire stretching from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean Sea. He was, in essence, building the first true regional empire in Assyrian history, setting a precedent for the larger, more terrifying empires to come. Shamshi-Adad was not just a warrior. He was also a shrewd administrator. He understood that conquest was only half the battle. Maintaining control required effective governance. He appointed his sons to govern key territories, notably his eldest, Shamshi-Adad in Mari, and his second son, Ishme-Dagan, in Ekalatum. He maintained an extensive network of correspondence, sending detailed instructions and receiving reports from across his vast domain. We know this because, like with the Karun tablets, archaeologists have unearthed an astonishing archive of his administrative correspondence, particularly from Mari. These letters reveal a king who was intimately involved in every aspect of his empire, from military strategy to agricultural output, even down to advising his sons on their personal conduct. Imagine a CEO who not only masterminds global expansion, but also dictates what color socks his regional managers should wear. That level of micromanagement, combined with grand vision, truly made him a figure to remember. His reign also saw significant economic and infrastructural development. He invested in irrigation projects, essential for agricultural prosperity, and consolidated the trade routes, ensuring their safety and efficiency. He even moved his capital from Ashur to a newly built city called Shubat-Enlil, strategically located to better oversee his burgeoning empire. This was a bold move, akin to a modern-day government deciding to build a brand new capital city in a more central location. It demonstrated his confidence and his commitment to a new, grander vision for Assyria, one that transcended the confines of Ashur. However, the nature of his empire was highly personal. It was built on his formidable will and military genius. His death, around 1776 BCE, marked a turning point. Historians still argue whether his empire was truly sustainable in the long term, or if it was simply a fleeting testament to one man's extraordinary capabilities. While his sons valiantly tried to maintain control, the intricate web of alliances and conquests began to unravel almost immediately upon his passing, demonstrating how much the empire truly relied on its founder. This dependency on a single charismatic leader is a recurring theme in ancient history, a stark reminder that even the grandest ambitions can be fragile when tied to the lifespan of one individual. For a brief shining moment, though, Shamshi-Adad I had shown the Assyrians what was possible, not just to trade across borders, but to rule them. The grand edifice that was Shamshi-Adad I's empire, built on ambition and martial prowess, proved to be as ephemeral as a sandcastle against the tide once its architect was gone. With his death, the carefully constructed network of alliances and conquests began to crumble, ushering in a period of decline for the old Assyrian Empire and the increasing influence of new regional powers, most notably the Kassites. It's a classic historical pattern, isn't it? A single dominant personality creates something magnificent, but without that force of will, the structure struggles to stand on its own. Imagine a perfectly choreographed dance where the lead dancer suddenly leaves the stage. Chaos, or at least a lot of bewildered shuffling, is sure to follow. Immediately after Shamshi-Adad's passing, his sons struggled to hold together the vast, disparate territories. Remember his son Yasmah-Adad ruling Mari? He quickly found himself outmatched by a resurgent Zimri-Lim, the legitimate king of Mari, who returned from exile to reclaim his throne. This was a significant blow, effectively dismantling a crucial part of Shamshi-Adad's western holdings. To the south, Hammurabi of Babylon, a name you might recognize for his famous law code, was meticulously building his own formidable empire. Hammurabi was a master strategist, playing rivals against each other and slowly, inexorably expanding his dominion. For a time, Hammurabi and Assyria were even allies against other powers. But as Babylon's strength grew, the balance of power shifted decisively. It's a bit like watching a chess game where one player slowly but surely corners all the pieces. The Assyrian heartland, centered around Ashur, found itself increasingly squeezed. The trade routes, once the lifeblood of its prosperity, became precarious. Without the overarching military might of Shamshi-Adad to protect them, merchants faced renewed threats from bandits and rival city-states. The economic engine that had fueled the old Assyrian Empire sputtered. This period isn't marked by glorious battles for Assyria, but rather by a series of retreats, concessions, and a shrinking sphere of influence. The kings who followed Shamshi-Adad were largely overshadowed by the rising stars of Mesopotamia, particularly Babylon. Ashur became, for a time, a vassal state, forced to pay tribute and acknowledge the suzerainty of more powerful neighbors. It's a humbling experience for a people who had briefly tasted regional dominance. A stark reminder that fortunes can turn quickly in the ancient world. Adding to the complexity of this era was the growing presence of the Kassites. Who were these mysterious people? The Kassites were a group originating from the Zagros Mountains to the east of Mesopotamia. Unlike the sophisticated urbanites of Sumer, Akkad, or Assyria, they were initially seen as something of an enigmatic, less culturally advanced force. They began to infiltrate Mesopotamia, not necessarily through large-scale invasion, but through gradual migration, often as laborers or mercenaries. However, as the region's established powers weakened, particularly after Hammurabi's death and the subsequent decline of the old Babylonian Empire, the Kassites seized their opportunity. They eventually established a powerful dynasty in Babylon, ruling for over 4 centuries. Historians still argue whether their rise was primarily due to military conquest or a more gradual political assimilation. But their impact was undeniable. The Kassite presence further complicated life for the struggling Assyrians. While Assyria was never fully conquered by the Kassites in the same way Babylon was, the Kassite kingdom to the south often exerted significant political pressure and controlled vital resources and trade routes. It was a period of sustained tension, punctuated by diplomatic maneuvering and occasional skirmishes. The Assyrians, who had once projected power outwards, now had to constantly look over their shoulders, wary of both the powerful Kassite state to their south and various Hurrian kingdoms to their north and west. It was an era of fragmentation, with Mesopotamia carved up among several competing powers, none truly dominant. This period of decline, sometimes referred to as a dark age for Assyria, due to the relative scarcity of detailed historical records compared to the old and later Neo-Assyrian periods, was crucial for shaping the Assyrian identity. It forced them to endure, to adapt, and to learn valuable lessons about resilience. They were no longer the dominant force, but they weren't extinguished either. They held onto their cultural identity, their religious practices centered on Ashur, and the memory of their past glories. It's a bit like a proud family business that falls on hard times but refuses to sell out, waiting for the opportunity to rebuild. This low point, however frustrating it must have been for the Assyrians of the time, was an essential crucible in which their fierce determination and later ambition were forged. They might have been down, but they were certainly not out. From the crucible of decline and the shadow of the Kassite ascendancy, something remarkable began to stir in Assyria. A resurgence, a slow but determined clawing back from the brink that would lay the groundwork for their later truly monumental empire. It's like watching a champion boxer who's been knocked down but not out. They get back up, bruised and battered, but with a renewed fire in their eyes and a deeper understanding of what it takes to win. This period, roughly from the 14th century BCE onwards, marks the beginning of the Middle Assyrian Empire, a crucial bridge between their mercantile past and their imperial future. The Assyrians had endured, maintaining their core identity and the city of Ashur, even when reduced to a shadow of their former selves. They were surrounded by powerful neighbors, the Kassite dynasty in Babylonia to the south, and the formidable Mitanni kingdom to the west, a powerful Hurrian state that, for a time, dominated much of northern Mesopotamia and Syria. For generations, Assyria was largely a vassal, or at best, a minor player in a game dominated by these larger entities. But underlying this period of subjugation was a simmering ambition, a quiet resolve to reclaim their former glory, and perhaps surpass it. This period of being under the thumb of others, ironically, honed their strategic thinking and military discipline. If you're constantly the underdog, you learn to fight smarter, not just harder. The turning point began subtly, with a series of relatively unheralded kings who started to chip away at the Mitanni influence. The Mitanni kingdom, while powerful, was not without its own internal stresses and external rivals, particularly the rising power of the Hittites in Anatolia. Historians still argue whether the decline of Mitanni was more due to Assyrian military pressure or internal fragmentation exacerbated by Hittite incursions. But the outcome was clear. Mitanni's grip on the region weakened, creating a power vacuum that Assyria was perfectly positioned to fill. This is a classic example of geopolitical opportunism, where a patient power waits for the stars to align, then strikes with precision. One of the pivotal figures in this early resurgence was Ashur-Uballit I, who ascended the throne around 1365 BCE. He was no armchair king. He was a shrewd diplomat and a pragmatic warrior. His reign marked a definitive break from Mitanni vassalage. He didn't just assert independence. He engaged directly with the other great powers of the day, Egypt and the Hittites. This is where things get truly fascinating. Instead of being a provincial minor kingdom, Assyria suddenly appeared on the international stage, corresponding with the pharaohs of Egypt on equal terms. We know this from the Amarna letters, a remarkable archive of diplomatic correspondence discovered in Egypt. These letters include letters from Ashur-Uballit to the Egyptian pharaoh, boldly stating his status as a great king and requesting gifts of gold in return for good relations. Imagine the sheer audacity. A king from a recently subjugated state demanding tribute-like gifts from the richest empire in the world. It showed a confidence that had been missing for centuries. Ashur-Uballit I's diplomatic offensive was backed by a growing military might. He began to challenge Mitanni directly, pushing back their influence and securing Assyria's northern borders. This wasn't about wholesale conquest yet, but about establishing Assyrian sovereignty and control over their immediate territories. He wasn't just playing defense. He was starting to project power. He understood that recognition on the international stage wasn't just about sending polite letters. It also required demonstrating the capacity to defend one's interests, forcefully if necessary. He also understood the importance of internal strength, consolidating power within Ashur and rebuilding the infrastructure that had suffered during the lean centuries. The success of Ashur-Uballit I set the stage for his successors to continue the expansion. Kings like Enlil-nirari and Arik-Danili further solidified Assyrian gains, engaging in battles with their Kassite neighbors to the south. These were often brutal, protracted conflicts, not always clear victories, but they demonstrated Assyria's renewed capacity to contend with a major power. It was a gradual process of rebuilding strength, one battle, one diplomatic maneuver, one fortified town at a time. The Assyrian military, which would later become the most feared fighting force in the ancient world, was slowly being forged in these smaller but significant conflicts. They were experimenting with new tactics, improving their logistics, and refining their brutal efficiency. This Middle Assyrian resurgence was not about flashy overnight conquests, but about a grinding, determined effort to restore their position. It marked a transition from merely surviving to actively thriving and expanding. The memory of Shamshi-Adad's brief empire provided a blueprint, a psychological precedent that showed what was possible. But this time, the expansion was built on a stronger, more disciplined foundation, setting the stage for the true imperial ambitions that would define Assyria for centuries to come. They had learned from their past failures and were now poised to show the ancient world that Assyria was back, and this time they weren't going anywhere. With Ashur-Uballit I having firmly re-established Assyria on the international stage, sending those rather cheeky letters to the Pharaoh of Egypt, the door was wide open for his successors to continue the slow, methodical process of expansion. This period of the Middle Assyrian Empire is less about grand, sweeping conquests right off the bat, and more about strategic consolidation, diplomatic maneuvering, and the grinding work of building a resilient state. It's like a careful gardener, having cleared the weeds, now begins to plant sturdy, long-lasting trees, rather than just pretty fleeting flowers. Ashur-Uballit I's reign, as we remember, was pivotal not just for asserting independence from the fading Mitanni, but for daring to engage with the other great kings of the late Bronze Age. This act alone signaled to the wider world that Assyria was no longer a regional backwater or a vassal state. It was a clear declaration: we are here, we are strong, and you will deal with us. This diplomatic recognition was a crucial psychological victory, perhaps even more so than any battlefield triumph at this stage. Think of it as gaining a seat at the adult table after years of being sent to the kids' table. Suddenly, your opinions matter, and you're part of the real conversation. This elevation in status allowed Assyria to navigate the complex web of late Bronze Age international relations with a newfound leverage. His successors, building on this foundation, continued to press Assyrian interests. Enlil-Nirari, c. 1327-1318 BCE, and Arik-Denili, c. 1317-1306 BCE, focused largely on strengthening Assyria's borders and engaging in skirmishes with their southern neighbors, the Kassite rulers of Babylonia. These were not decisive empire-building wars, but rather attritional conflicts, battles over disputed territories and resources. Imagine two rival gangs constantly bickering over turf, with occasional brutal street fights. These conflicts, though seemingly localized, were vital in hardening the Assyrian army and establishing a clear frontier against the powerful Kassite state. It also instilled in the Assyrians a deep-seated rivalry with Babylon, a rivalry that would simmer for centuries and explode in spectacular fashion in later periods. It's a bit like a centuries-long sibling rivalry, except with more chariots and fewer arguments over who gets the last slice of pizza. However, the real genius of this period wasn't just in the military sphere, but in the administrative reforms that began to take shape. The Assyrians learned from the weaknesses of Shamshi-Adad's empire, which crumbled because it was too dependent on one man. They started to develop a more robust bureaucracy, a system of provincial governors, and a more centralized collection of resources. This was crucial for sustaining any long-term expansion. You can conquer territory all day long, but if you can't administer it, collect taxes, and maintain order, it's just a temporary occupation. This bureaucratic efficiency would become a hallmark of the later Neo-Assyrian Empire, allowing them to manage truly vast territories. They were, in essence, developing the operating system for their future imperial machine. The Middle Assyrian period also saw a significant investment in fortifications and infrastructure. With their independence secured and their ambitions growing, the Assyrians began to build and rebuild, strengthening their cities and strategically placed fortresses. This wasn't just about defense. It was about projecting strength and ensuring secure lines of communication and supply for their military campaigns. These were practical steps, unglamorous but utterly essential for a burgeoning power. Imagine building a superhighway network before you even have a decent number of cars, but knowing that soon the traffic will be immense. The Assyrians also began to develop their characteristic military innovations. While the full might of their war machine wouldn't be unleashed for another few centuries, the foundations were being laid. They refined their use of chariots, improved their siege tactics, and emphasized rigorous training and discipline. This wasn't just about bigger armies. It was about better, more professional armies. The core of what would make the Neo-Assyrian army so fearsome, its organization, its engineering prowess, its relentless pursuit of military objectives, was slowly being forged in this era of resurgence. Historians still argue whether the Middle Assyrian Empire truly constituted a fully fledged empire, or was more of a regional kingdom with significant influence. But what is undeniable is that this period was one of vital transition and growth. It was where Assyria shed the vestiges of its earlier decline and began to realize its potential as a dominant power in the Near East. The patient, methodical work of these kings, often overshadowed by their more famous successors, set the stage for the dramatic, brutal, and ultimately awe-inspiring expansion that was just over the horizon. They were not just recovering, they were preparing for something far greater. With the Assyrians regaining their footing and daring to assert themselves on the international stage, the foundations for future grandeur were set. And then, as if on cue, along came a king who wasn't content with merely securing borders or engaging in polite diplomacy. This was Tukulti-Ninurta the Firm, a name that, if you were an enemy of Assyria around the late 13th century BCE, would send shivers down your spine. He was the kind of ruler who didn't just play chess. He flipped the board over and declared himself the winner. His reign from approximately 1243 to 1207 BCE marks a significant escalation in Assyrian ambition, transforming them from a regional power to an undeniable imperial force, at least for a while. Tukulti-Ninurta: I was a king of relentless imperial ambition and a military strategist of chilling effectiveness. He didn't just expand Assyria's borders, he sought to establish unquestioned dominance over his neighbors, particularly the long-standing rival Babylonia, still under Kassite rule. Imagine someone who, after years of polite competition, decides to just obliterate the opposition entirely. That was his approach. He harbored a deep-seated desire to subjugate Babylon, a city that represented not only a powerful political entity, but also a profound cultural and religious center. This rivalry was personal, historical, and deeply ingrained in the Assyrian psyche. His defining moment, the one that truly cemented his place in history, was his decisive victory over the Kassite king of Babylonia, Shamshi-Adad IV. This wasn't just a border skirmish. This was a full-scale invasion, culminating in the capture of Babylon itself. Think about that for a moment. Babylon, the venerable city, often seen as the cultural heart of Mesopotamia, was sacked by the Assyrians. This was an unthinkable feat, a psychological blow to the entire Near East. Tukulti-Ninurta, I didn't just defeat Shamshi-Adad, he dragged him back to Ashur in chains, a shocking display of humiliation for a king of such a prestigious city. This act alone sent a clear message. No one was safe, and Assyria was now the preeminent power. Historians still argue whether this conquest was truly a long-term strategic advantage for Assyria, or if it overextended their resources and sowed the seeds of future resentment. Following this monumental victory, Tukulti-Ninurta II adopted the grandiose title of King of Kings and King of Sumer and Akkad, titles traditionally held by Babylonian rulers. This wasn't just boasting, it was a powerful statement of his claim to universal Mesopotamian sovereignty. He even moved the statue of the Babylonian chief god, Marduk, to Ashur, a deeply symbolic act that asserted Assyrian religious and political supremacy. It was akin to moving the Statue of Liberty to another country, a clear declaration of conquest and dominance. He was essentially telling the world, "Your gods are now my gods, and they reside in my capital." Beyond Babylon, Tukulti-Ninurta, I campaigned extensively to secure and expand his northern and eastern frontiers. He pushed deep into the Nairi lands, a region encompassing various tribes around Lake Van in modern-day Turkey and Armenia, securing vital resources and controlling strategic mountain passes. He also asserted Assyrian authority over the Hurrian states in the west, further diminishing any remaining Mitanni influence and extending Assyrian reach towards the Euphrates. His campaigns were characterized by their relentless nature and his innovative use of military logistics, allowing his armies to operate effectively far from their home base. However, despite his undeniable military genius, Tukulti-Ninurta III's reign ended dramatically and tragically. His aggressive policies, particularly his heavy-handed treatment of Babylon and his attempts to centralize power, alienated many within his own court and among the conquered peoples. He even moved his capital from Ashur to a new, purpose-built city, Tukulti-Ninurta, much like Shamshi-Adad I had done. This was an attempt to create a capital truly reflective of his imperial vision, free from the traditional power brokers of Ashur. But such radical changes often breed resentment. His reign culminated in his assassination, likely by his own son, Ashur-Nedin-Apli, and other high-ranking officials. It's a stark reminder that even the most powerful rulers can fall when they push too hard against the established order, or when their ambition outpaces their political acumen. He conquered the known world, only to be undone by those closest to him. It's almost Shakespearean, isn't it? His death plunged Assyria into a period of uncertainty and decline, demonstrating once again the fragility of empires built too heavily on the shoulders of a single, extraordinary individual. While he had brought Assyria to an unprecedented level of power and demonstrated its capacity for truly vast conquests, the empire he built was not yet resilient enough to withstand internal strife and external pressures without his iron fist. But the memory of his conquests, particularly the fall of Babylon, would linger, inspiring future Assyrian kings to rekindle the flame of imperial ambition. The stunning collapse of Tukulti-Ninurta-Thot's reign, ending not in glorious battle, but in a palace coup orchestrated by his own kin, plunged the mighty Middle Assyrian Empire into a period of internal strife and a gradual descent into what historians sometimes refer to as a dark age. It's a sobering reminder that even the most formidable empires are built on human hands, and those hands can turn against their master. Imagine a complex machine humming with efficiency, suddenly having its vital cogs sabotaged from within. The grand momentum slows, then grinds to a halt, leaving only echoes of its former power. After Tukulti-Ninurta-Thot's assassination around 1207 BCE, Assyria found itself facing a combination of internal political instability and renewed external pressures. The kings who followed, such as Ashurnasirpal II, who was likely complicit in his father's demise, struggled to maintain the vast territories that Tukulti-Ninurta had so forcefully acquired. The grip on conquered lands, especially far-flung regions, loosened rapidly. The symbolic act of bringing Marduk's statue to Ashur, once a proud display of dominance, now became a source of contention and resentment, particularly from the ever-resilient Babylonians who yearned for the return of their deity. The internal power struggles were exacerbated by a series of weak or short-lived reigns. Succession was often contested, leading to periods of civil unrest and a fragmentation of central authority. This wasn't the disciplined, unified Assyria that had emerged under Ashur-Uballit, or the ruthless juggernaut of Tukulti-Ninurta-Thot. Instead, it was a kingdom grappling with its own identity, torn between the ambition of imperial conquest and the reality of its diminished capacity. Think of a family business where the patriarch dies suddenly, and the heirs squabble over who gets to run the show, causing the whole enterprise to suffer. Compounding these internal woes was a broader regional crisis that began to grip the entire Near East, the mysterious Late Bronze Age collapse. Have you ever wondered what happens when entire civilizations just disappear? Around the same time, from roughly 1200 to 1150 BCE, a wave of societal collapse swept across the Mediterranean and Near East. Major powers like the Hittite Empire crumbled. Mycenaean Greece fell into a period of illiteracy and depopulation, and Egypt significantly weakened. This period, often attributed to a combination of factors including climate change, internal revolts, economic disruption, and the enigmatic sea peoples, created a volatile and unpredictable environment. While historians still argue fiercely over the precise causes and effects of this widespread collapse, its impact on Assyria was undeniable. For Assyria, This meant a resurgence of threats from various directions. The Arameans, semi-nomadic tribes migrating from the west, began to infiltrate Assyrian territory, disrupting trade routes and settling in the fertile lands of northern Mesopotamia. These weren't organized armies aiming for conquest. They were persistent, often violent, incursions that eroded central authority and chipped away at Assyrian control over its agricultural heartland. It was a bit like trying to stop 1,000 small leaks in a dam. Individually, they're manageable, but collectively, they threaten to bring the whole structure down. Meanwhile, the Kassite dynasty in Babylonia, though weakened, found opportunities to assert itself against a distracted and struggling Assyria. The rivalry continued, often resulting in border conflicts that further drained Assyrian resources. To the north, other groups like the Nairi, whom Tukulti-Ninurta Tawan had subjugated, reasserted their independence, forcing Assyria to fight defensive wars rather than project power. The ambitious imperial dream had, for a time, receded into a grim reality of holding on to what little they had left. The historical records from this period become noticeably sparse, contributing to its label as a dark age. This doesn't mean nothing happened, but rather that the centralized administration capable of producing and preserving extensive royal annals weakened considerably. It suggests a time of instability where maintaining records was less of a priority than simply surviving. Ashur itself, while never completely abandoned, likely saw a decrease in its power and influence. It was a far cry from the bustling international hub of the old Assyrian Empire, or the confident imperial capital envisioned by Tukulti-Ninurta. Yet even in this period of apparent decline, the seeds of future revival were being preserved. The core institutions of Assyrian kingship, the cult of Ashur, and the military traditions, however diminished, continued to exist. The memory of past glories, particularly the conquests of Shamshi-Adad and Tukulti-Ninurta, would have lingered, serving as a powerful motivator for future generations. It's like a family remembering the days when they owned a thriving business, even if they're currently just scraping by. That memory, that belief in what they once were, would prove to be incredibly resilient. And as the wider late Bronze Age world crumbled around them, Assyria, despite its struggles, endured, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Just when it seemed Assyria might fade into the historical footnotes, swallowed by internal strife and the chaos of the late Bronze Age collapse, a new dawn broke. Emerging from the Dark Age, much like a phoenix from the ashes, though perhaps a slightly more heavily armored and battle-scarred phoenix, came Tiglath-Pileser I. His reign from approximately 1115 to 1076 BCE marked a significant and vigorous resurgence, truly bringing the Middle Assyrian Empire to new heights and setting a formidable precedent for the imperial future. If the previous era was about barely holding on, this was about grabbing the bull by the horns and shaking it fiercely. Tiglath-Pileser, I was not a king who enjoyed quiet contemplation. His royal annals, which are surprisingly detailed for this period after the Dark Age, paint a picture of an exceptionally energetic and militarily active monarch. He was a master of grand campaigns, and his reign is characterized by relentless expansion in all directions. Imagine a general who never takes a day off, constantly looking for the next frontier to conquer. He saw Assyria's diminished state not as a defeat, but as a challenge, and he responded with an almost furious determination. His immediate priority was to reassert Assyrian control over territories that had slipped away during the preceding century of instability. The most pressing threat came from the Arameans, those semi-nomadic groups who had infiltrated and settled extensively in northern Mesopotamia, disrupting trade routes and diminishing Assyrian agricultural lands. Tiglath-Pileser. I launched a series of devastating campaigns against them, not just pushing them back, but often pursuing them across the Euphrates River, an unprecedented feat for an Assyrian king at this time. He boasts in his inscriptions of defeating the Arameans an astonishing 14 times in a single year, which, while probably an exaggeration for propaganda purposes, certainly highlights the intensity of his efforts. These campaigns were crucial for reopening the vital trade arteries and restoring Assyrian control over its agricultural heartland, essentially clearing out the squatters who had moved into their metaphorical backyard. But Tiglath-Pileser's ambitions extended far beyond simply containing the Arameans. He pushed Assyrian power westward, reaching the Mediterranean Sea, a momentous achievement that resonated through the ancient world. He records hunting wild bulls near the sea and receiving tribute from coastal cities, a clear demonstration of his far-reaching influence. This expansion brought Assyria into contact with the rich city-states of the Levant, opening up new avenues for trade and, of course, for conquest. He was essentially showing the world that Assyria was not just a Mesopotamian power, but a force to be reckoned with across the wider Near East. To the north, he campaigned extensively against the Nairi lands and other mountain tribes, securing the sources of crucial resources like timber and metal. These were often brutal mountain campaigns, requiring immense logistical skill and military discipline. He also ventured into Urartu territory, laying the groundwork for future Assyrian conflicts with that powerful northern kingdom. To the south, he engaged in renewed conflict with the Kassite rulers of Babylonia, reasserting Assyrian military superiority, though he did not attempt another full-scale conquest and occupation of Babylon itself, perhaps having learned the hard lesson from Tukulti-Ninurta's downfall. Historians still argue whether his decision not to permanently occupy Babylon was a sign of strategic foresight or simply a recognition of the limits of his resources. Beyond military prowess, Tiglath-Pileser was also a significant patron of culture and architecture. He invested heavily in rebuilding and restoring temples and public buildings in Ashur and other important cities. His inscriptions often detail his pious acts, emphasizing his devotion to the gods, particularly Ashur. This served not only as a religious duty, but also as a powerful propaganda tool, associating his reign with divine favor and prosperity. He was, in essence, trying to rebuild not just the empire's physical infrastructure, but also its spiritual and psychological core. He was also keenly interested in the natural world, a detail that might surprise you about such a fierce warrior. His annals mention his interest in exotic animals and plants, even detailing his passion for hunting, which was often viewed as a royal prerogative and a display of kingly power. He imported cedars from Lebanon, a sign of his far-reaching influence and a practical way to acquire valuable building material. The reign of Tiglath-Pileser I was a golden age for the Middle Assyrian Empire, demonstrating a remarkable recovery from the preceding Dark Age. He successfully re-established Assyria as a major power, extending its influence across a broad geographical area. He built on the administrative reforms of his predecessors and further refined the Assyrian military machine. However, as with many great reigns, his successes were largely tied to his personal dynamism. The empire, though formidable, was still somewhat fragile and would face renewed challenges after his death. But the blueprint for a truly vast, iron-fisted empire had now been clearly laid out. The monumental achievements of Tiglath-Pileser I, who stretched Assyrian power to the very shores of the Mediterranean, might have seemed like the beginning of an unstoppable new era. Yet, as so often happens in the ebb and flow of ancient history, even the most impressive gains can be fleeting. Immediately following his death, Assyria entered another period of significant challenge, marked primarily by relentless Aramean invasions and a subsequent retreat of Assyrian influence. It was as if the tide that had surged so powerfully under Tiglath-Pileser I now began to recede, leaving the Assyrian heartland vulnerable once more. The Arameans, remember them, those persistent, often migratory groups from the west, who Tiglath-Pileser I had so fiercely battled and supposedly tamed. Well, it turns out they were not so easily tamed. Their incursions were less about organized, grand-scale invasions and more about continuous, relentless pressure. Imagine trying to seal a leaky sieve, plug one hole, and another springs open. These were not the vast disciplined armies that would characterize later empires, but rather numerous smaller groups, skilled in nomadic warfare, who disrupted trade, seized agricultural lands, and destabilized Assyrian control over its outlying territories. They established numerous small kingdoms and city-states across northern Syria and Mesopotamia, effectively creating a sea of Aramean that encroached upon what Assyria considered its rightful domain. The reasons for this renewed Aramean surge are multifaceted. Firstly, the sheer dynamism of Tiglath-Pileser was difficult to replicate. Subsequent Assyrian kings, while perhaps competent, lacked his extraordinary drive and military genius. The constant campaigning required to keep the Arameans at bay was incredibly resource-intensive, and without a leader of Tiglath-Pileser's caliber, the effort became unsustainable. Secondly, the late Bronze Age collapse, while easing the pressure from major powers like the Hittites, had created a power vacuum across the Levant and Syria, which the Arameans were perfectly positioned to fill. They were adaptable and mobile, traits that served them well in a fragmented and unstable world. The impact on Assyria was profound. The crucial trade routes, so painstakingly re-established by Tiglath-Pileser I, became unsafe once more. This led to economic hardship in the Assyrian heartland, as access to vital raw materials and lucrative markets diminished. Cities that relied on this commerce would have felt the pinch, leading to discontent and a weakening of the central government's authority. Furthermore, the loss of agricultural lands due to Aramean settlement directly impacted Assyria's food supply and tax base. It was a vicious cycle. Less food meant less population, less taxes meant fewer resources for the army, and a weaker army meant more vulnerability to Aramean incursions. This period, stretching roughly from the late 11th century BCE through much of the 10th century BCE, is often considered another dark age for Assyria. Our historical records become scarce again, much like the period before Tiglath-Pileser. This scarcity itself is telling, suggesting a decline in centralized administration, a lack of resources for monumental building projects, and thus inscriptions, and a general preoccupation with survival rather than grand imperial narratives. The Assyrian kings of this era, names like Ashur-bel-Kala, Adad-nirari II, and Ashur-dan II, spent much of their reigns fighting defensive wars, trying to contain the Aramean tide rather than expanding Assyrian influence. The focus shifted from projecting power far afield to merely holding on to the core Assyrian territories around Ashur, and Kalhu. The empire contracted significantly, effectively becoming a regional kingdom once more. The dream of Mediterranean access, so triumphantly realized by Tiglath-Pileser, vanished for a time. It's a bit like a once dominant global corporation having to pull back to its home market, focusing purely on keeping the lights on. Yet, even in this era of contraction, a crucial transformation was taking place. The constant pressure from the Arameans, while devastating in the short term, ironically forced the Assyrians to become even more resilient, more militaristic, and more efficient in their core operations. They learned the brutal lessons of sustained, low-level warfare. This period of intense defensive struggle would, perhaps counterintuitively, temper their military machine, making it even more formidable when the conditions were right for another expansion. It's like a blacksmith repeatedly hammering and heating iron. Each blow makes the metal stronger. So while the 10th century BCE was not a period of glorious Assyrian conquest, it was a time of adaptation and hardening. The Assyrian identity, forged in frontier resilience and tempered by cycles of decline and resurgence, remained intact. They might have been temporarily pushed back, but the fundamental spirit of Ashur, the ambition to dominate, was merely dormant, waiting for the right moment and the right king to ignite it once more. And that moment and that king were just around the corner, ready to unleash a power the likes of which the world had never truly seen. After a period of struggle and retrenchment, where the Assyrian lion seemed to be licking its wounds rather than roaring across the plains, a new king ascended the throne who would redefine Assyrian power and usher in the truly terrifying era of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This was Ashurnasirpal II, who reigned from 883 to 859 BCE, and his name, if you were a city-state minding its own business anywhere near Mesopotamia, meant one thing: trouble, with a capital T. He was not merely a warrior. He was an architect of terror who perfected a strategy of brutal efficiency designed to break the will of any potential adversary. Imagine, if you dare, a meticulous artist whose medium is fear and whose canvas is the entire Near East. Ashurnasirpal II inherited a kingdom that, while having endured the Aramean incursions, was still far from its former glory or its future imperial might. His immediate task was to re-establish unquestioned Assyrian dominance over northern Mesopotamia and to project power beyond it. He didn't waste any time. His campaigns were relentless, swift, and utterly merciless. Unlike previous kings, who might have been content with tribute or a show of submission, Ashurnasirpal II's policy was one of systematic subjugation and, if necessary, total devastation. He wasn't just defeating armies, he was shattering societies. His royal annals are perhaps the most chillingly detailed accounts of warfare and conquest from the ancient world. They are not merely records of victories, but rather boasts of brutality, meticulously listing the atrocities committed against rebellious cities and populations. He describes impaling captives on stakes, flaying rebel leaders, and spreading their skins on city walls, blinding dissidents, and building pyramids of skulls. It sounds horrific, and it was. But this wasn't random savagery. This was a calculated policy, designed to instill such profound terror that future rebellions would be unthinkable. His message was clear: resist Assyria, and your suffering will be broadcast for all to see, a stark warning to anyone else contemplating defiance. Historians still argue whether this calculated cruelty was more effective than sheer military might in securing long-term control. But there's no denying its immediate impact. It must have been terrifying. Ashurnasirpal II also understood the importance of logistics and organization in warfare. His army was not just brutal, it was incredibly well-drilled, disciplined, and equipped. He developed and refined the use of various siege engines, enabling his forces to overcome even the most heavily fortified cities. His troops were proficient in everything from engineering to intelligence gathering. This was a military machine designed for sustained conquest and occupation, far beyond the capabilities of any previous Assyrian force. He wasn't just sending out war parties. He was deploying a professional, multifaceted invasion force. A key part of his strategy was the deportation of conquered populations. Instead of simply slaughtering everyone, though he did a fair bit of that, he would often uproot entire communities, moving them to distant parts of the empire. This served several purposes. It removed rebellious elements from their homeland, preventing future uprisings. It provided labor for his massive building projects, and it mixed different ethnic and cultural groups, making it harder for them to coalesce into new threats. It was a cruel but effective way of homogenizing his growing empire, ensuring that loyalty, or at least submission, was directed solely to Ashur. Ashurnasirpal II also embarked on an ambitious program of building and renovation, most notably the construction of his new capital city, Kalhu, modern-day Nimrud. This wasn't just a place for him to live. It was a grandiose statement of Assyrian power and wealth, designed to impress and intimidate. He filled it with magnificent palaces, temples, and colossal winged human-headed bulls, Lamassu, guarding the gates. The opulence and scale of Kalhu were unprecedented, signaling to both his subjects and foreign dignitaries that Assyria was now truly an empire of immense resources and unbridled ambition. Imagine building a city that was essentially a giant advertisement for how powerful and intimidating you were. He also established vast royal gardens filled with exotic plants and animals brought from his campaigns. Perhaps a small, almost whimsical detail in an otherwise terrifying reign. His campaigns extended throughout northern Mesopotamia, across the Euphrates, into Syria, and into the mountain regions to the north and east. He re-established firm Assyrian control over the strategic trade routes and secured access to vital resources like timber and metal. The tribute he collected from conquered states fueled his building projects and maintained his formidable army. By the end of his reign, Assyria had been transformed from a struggling regional power into the dominant force in the Near East, laying the ideological and practical groundwork for the empire that would follow. Ashurnasirpal II didn't just rebuild Assyria, he reforged it into an instrument of unparalleled power and terror, with Ashurnasirpal II having perfected the art of calculated terror and built a dazzling new capital. The stage was set for the Assyrian Empire to flex its muscles on an even grander scale. His son and successor, Shalmaneser III, who reigned from 859 to 824 BCE, took the already formidable Assyrian war machine and directed it into an era of constant warfare, engaging not just in punitive raids, but in sustained campaigns against powerful coalitions of rivals. If his father was the architect of fear, Shalmaneser III was the relentless hammer, constantly testing the limits of Assyrian might against a vast array of formidable adversaries. Shalmaneser, though, inherited an empire that, while internally strong, faced significant external challenges. The very success of Ashurnasirpal II had created powerful enemies. The independent states of Syria and the Levant, now directly threatened by Assyrian expansion towards the Mediterranean, began to realize that their individual survival depended on collective action. This led to the formation of formidable coalitions, creating some of the most epic and strategically complex conflicts of the ancient Near East. It's like a group of smaller nations suddenly realizing that if they don't band together, they'll all be picked off one by one, a truly ancient version of strength in numbers. His most famous and historically significant confrontation was against the Syro-Hittite coalition led by Ben-Hadad II of Damascus and Ahab of Israel, culminating in the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE. Imagine a massive clash of ancient armies, chariots thundering across the plains, infantry clashing with brutal force. Shalmaneser III's own inscriptions boast of a resounding victory, claiming to have inflicted immense casualties on his enemies. However, unlike some of his father's clear-cut annihilations, this battle seems to have been more of a bloody stalemate. While Shalmaneser claimed victory and celebrated it as such, he was unable to achieve a decisive breakthrough or immediately conquer Damascus, suggesting the coalition held its ground remarkably well. This nuance is fascinating because it shows that even the mighty Assyrian war machine could be slowed, if not stopped, by determined resistance. Historians still argue whether Karkar was a true Assyrian victory or a Pyrrhic one, but its significance lies in demonstrating the scale of the opposition Assyria was beginning to face. Despite this initial setback, or perhaps fueled by it, Shalmaneser III continued his relentless campaigns year after year. He launched repeated invasions into Syria and the Levant, chipping away at the coalition's strength, slowly but surely bringing more cities and kingdoms under Assyrian control or into a tributary relationship. He wasn't always victorious, But his persistence was legendary. He constantly campaigned against the powerful state of Urartu to the north, a formidable rival situated in the mountainous regions around Lake Van, modern-day Turkey and Armenia. These campaigns were often brutal and logistically challenging, fighting in difficult terrain against a well-organized enemy. Urartu, with its own impressive fortifications and military, would remain a thorn in Assyria's side for centuries. Shalmaneser III's reign was also significant for the sheer volume and geographical breadth of his military expeditions. His annals record campaigns against peoples and kingdoms as far-flung as Cilicia in southern Anatolia, the Zagros Mountains to the east, and various nomadic tribes. He truly extended Assyrian influence, even if not always direct rule, over an unprecedented area. This constant warfare, however, came at a cost. It strained Assyria's resources and eventually led to internal dissent. Towards the end of his long reign, Shalmaneser III faced a serious rebellion led by one of his own sons, Ashur-Danipal, which engulfed the Assyrian heartland and threatened to tear the empire apart. This internal conflict, sometimes lasting for years, demonstrated the immense pressure that constant warfare and an increasingly centralized, demanding imperial system placed on the Assyrian elite. It's a classic cautionary tale. Even the most powerful leaders can be undone by discontent brewing within their own ranks. The rebellion was eventually put down by another son, Shamshi-Adad I, who you might remember in the next section. But it highlighted the fragility that could still exist beneath the veneer of imperial might. Despite this internal turmoil, Shalmaneser III left an undeniable legacy. He expanded the empire's reach significantly, secured crucial trade routes, and firmly established Assyria as the dominant power in the Near East. His Black Obelisk, discovered at Kalhu, is a famous monument depicting tribute being paid by various conquered peoples, including Jehu, king of Israel, an extremely rare visual confirmation of a biblical figure in Assyrian art. It stands as a testament to his wide-ranging conquests and the vastness of the empire he controlled. His reign cemented the strategy of aggressive expansion and constant military campaigning that would define the Neo-Assyrian Empire for the next 2 centuries, demonstrating that once you embark on a path of relentless conquest, it's incredibly hard to stop. The tumultuous end of Shalmaneser III's reign, marred by a bitter internal rebellion, created a moment of profound vulnerability for the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Yet, from this near catastrophe, a new king, Adad-Nirari III, emerged to reclaim Assyria's dominance and, crucially, address the rising threat from the northern kingdom of Urartu. His reign from 811 to 783 BCE marks a period of recovery and strategic shifts, a demonstration that Assyrian power, even when shaken, possessed an incredible capacity for resilience. Imagine a mighty ship, battered by a storm, but capable of righting itself and setting a new, determined course. Adad-Nirari III inherited an empire that was, frankly, a bit of a mess internally, still reeling from the civil war between his father and uncle. His immediate predecessor, his mother, Queen Samuramat, sometimes identified with the mythical Semiramis, though historians still argue about the extent of her actual power and regency, played a crucial role in stabilizing the empire in the interregnum. This is a fascinating detail, a rare glimpse of a powerful female figure exerting significant influence in a patriarchal society. And it underscores the depth of the crisis that allowed such a regency to occur. Adad-nirari III's primary challenge was twofold: reasserting firm control over the Assyrian heartland and its vassal states, and confronting the increasingly powerful and aggressive kingdom of Urartu to the north. Urartu, located in the mountainous terrain around Lake Van, modern-day Turkey and Armenia, had been a persistent thorn in Assyria's side for generations. They were formidable warriors, skilled metalworkers, and adept at building strong fortifications. While Shalmaneser III had campaigned against them, he had never truly broken their power. Urartu saw Assyria's internal strife as an opportunity to expand its own influence, posing a direct threat to Assyria's northern borders and control over vital trade routes to the Caucasus. Adad-nirari III recognized Urartu as a strategic long-term threat. He launched a series of concentrated campaigns against them, pushing into their mountainous strongholds and attempting to curb their expansion. These were not easy victories. The terrain favored the defenders, and the Urartian army was well-trained and motivated. His inscriptions detailed these hard-fought battles, often highlighting the logistical difficulties of campaigning in such rugged lands. His focus on Urartu demonstrates a clear strategic shift. Securing the northern frontier against a powerful, consolidated rival was deemed more critical than continuous, wide-ranging campaigns into the Levant, at least initially. While Urartu posed the most significant strategic threat, Adad-nirari III also campaigned extensively in the west, reasserting Assyrian authority over the Aramean states and the city kingdoms of the Levant. His annals record punitive campaigns against Damascus, the powerful Aramean state that had previously defied Shalmaneser III. He boasts of receiving tribute from many Western rulers, including the kings of Israel, likely Jehoash or Jeroboam II, Tyre, and Sidon. This re-establishment of Western control was vital for Assyria's economic health, ensuring the flow of tribute and securing access to Mediterranean trade routes. It also showed that Assyria was still the dominant force in the West, even after a period of relative weakness. Adad-nirari III's reign is also notable for a renewed emphasis on religious piety and the cult of the god Nabu, the god of writing and wisdom. Inscriptions mention his devotion to Nabu, and a prominent temple was built for this deity at Kalhu. This focus on religious legitimacy was likely an attempt to reinforce central authority and unite the empire after the internal turmoil. It's a classic move. When things are chaotic, rally the people around shared faith and divine endorsement of the king. However, despite his successes in stabilizing the empire and checking Urartu's rise, the latter part of Adad-nirari III's reign saw a gradual weakening of royal authority. There's some evidence that powerful court officials and provincial governors began to accrue more power, a recurring issue for Assyrian kings as the empire grew. This internal shift, sometimes referred to as the magnate's ascendancy, would lead to another period of relative decline for the central government after Adad-nirari III's death. It's almost as if the Assyrian machine, once wound up by a strong hand, had a tendency to unwind a bit when the pressure was off. only to be wound up again by the next powerful king. Nonetheless, Adad-nirari III successfully navigated a challenging period for Assyria. He prevented a full-scale collapse after his father's tumultuous end, checked the burgeoning power of Urartu, and re-established Assyrian dominance in the west. He was a steady hand on the tiller, ensuring that the ship of state, though facing turbulent waters, remained on course towards its imperial destiny. He laid the groundwork for the later truly global expansion of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, demonstrating that Assyria's resilience was as much a part of its character as its brutality. In the midst of Assyria's shifting fortunes, with kings battling external threats and internal power struggles, there's a fascinating and rather peculiar narrative that intersects with Assyrian history, one that you might even know from ancient religious texts. This is the intriguing story of Jonah and Assyrian prophecy, a tale that offers a unique, albeit non-Assyrian, perspective on the empire's formidable reputation and the pervasive fear it inspired. It's a strange fact, isn't it, that a tiny, almost insignificant text from a different culture can tell us so much about how truly intimidating the Assyrians were. The book of Jonah, found in the Hebrew Bible, tells the story of a prophet commanded by God to go to Nineveh, the great city of the Assyrians, and cry out against its wickedness. Now, why would this be a strange fact for our Assyrian story? Because Jonah's initial reaction is not to obey, but to flee in the opposite direction, clearly terrified of his divine mission. He attempts to escape by ship, leading to the famous incident with the big fish. This isn't just a story about disobedience. It's a story rooted in the profound fear that Nineveh and Assyria commanded in the minds of their contemporaries. If God tells you to go to Nineveh, and your first thought is, nope, absolutely not, I'd rather be swallowed by a whale, it tells you something about the reputation of that city and its people. Nineveh, even at this point, was becoming the ultimate symbol of Assyrian power and cruelty. While it hadn't yet reached its full architectural glory under Sennacherib or Ashurbanipal, it was already known as a major center of the Assyrian Empire. The prophecies against it, particularly in the later book of Nahum, describe it as a bloody city, all full of lies and plunder, a lion's den from which the Assyrians devoured nations. This imagery, repeated across various ancient texts, paints a vivid picture of the fear and resentment Assyria inspired. It wasn't just their armies that were terrifying. It was their systematic, ruthless approach to empire that left an indelible mark on the collective psyche of the Near East. The story of Jonah focuses on the idea of repentance and divine mercy. But for our purposes, it's the backdrop that is so revealing. Jonah's mission, upon finally arriving in Nineveh after his aquatic detour, is to preach of the city's impending destruction within 40 days due to its wickedness. And here's the most surprising part of the tale. The king of Nineveh, along with his people, believes Jonah, repents in sackcloth and ashes, and God relents from bringing the promised destruction. This is an almost unimaginable scenario from a purely historical Assyrian perspective, isn't it? The proud, unyielding, brutal Assyrians humbling themselves at the words of a foreign prophet. Historians still argue fiercely about the historicity of the Book of Jonah itself, and particularly the repentance of Nineveh. No Assyrian records corroborate such an event. The Assyrians, after all, weren't exactly known for their widespread adoption of foreign religious warnings, or for their penchant for public acts of contrition. However, the story, regardless of its literal historical accuracy, serves as a powerful testament to two things. First, the overwhelming reputation of Nineveh and Assyria as a place of immense power and deserved divine judgment, and second, a theological wish for even the most formidable enemy to be capable of change. It provides a moral counterpoint to the relentless image of Assyrian brutality, even if it might be more an ideal than a reflection of reality. It's a bit like imagining Darth Vader suddenly deciding to knit sweaters for charity. A nice thought, but probably not going to happen. The presence of such a story, portraying Nineveh as the ultimate symbol of a powerful, threatening empire, whose fate was intertwined with divine judgment, highlights how deeply the Assyrians had permeated the consciousness of their neighbors. Their actions, their conquests, and their methods were not just political events. They were seen as having cosmic significance. The prophet's reluctance, the city's reputation, and the dramatic, if improbable, repentance all speak volumes about the pervasive dread that the Assyrian Empire inspired. While Adad-nirari III had stabilized the empire, the period immediately following his reign would again see a dip in central authority, sometimes called the Magnates era. This created a backdrop where perhaps a narrative of potential divine intervention against such a powerful but distant empire might have resonated. The threat was always there, hanging over smaller nations, even if Assyria was momentarily preoccupied with internal issues or other foes. The story of Jonah, therefore, serves as a unique historical echo, a whisper from the past, not from Assyrian annals, but from the anxious prayers and hopes of those who lived under their colossal shadow, constantly wondering when the hammer would fall. After the interlude of internal struggles and the symbolic dread exemplified by the story of Jonah, Assyria was ready for its next great leap forward. The early 8th century BCE had seen a period of relative quiet, sometimes called the Era of the Magnates, where powerful provincial governors often wielded more effective power than the kings themselves. But this decentralization was unsustainable for an empire built on ruthless central control. The stage was perfectly set for a powerful figure to reclaim the throne's authority and propel Assyria into its zenith. That figure was Tiglath-Pileser III, who reigned from 745 to 727 BCE. His ascension marked the true birth of the Neo-Assyrian Empire as we often envision it, a sprawling, highly organized, and utterly ruthless machine designed for conquest and sustained dominance. He wasn't just a king, he was a strategic genius and a radical reformer. Tiglath-Pileser III came to power through a coup, possibly against the weak king Ashurnasirpal V. This forceful seizure of the throne immediately signaled a departure from the previous era of royal feebleness. He understood that the old ways of intermittent campaigns and relatively loose vassalage were no longer sufficient. The empire needed a complete overhaul, a total transformation into an efficient, centralized juggernaut. It's like a failing corporation bringing in a ruthless CEO who completely restructures the company, cuts all the dead weight, and focuses solely on market dominance. His first and most enduring legacy was his radical administrative reforms. He systematically dismantled the power of the overly strong provincial governors, replacing them with officials directly appointed by and loyal to the king. To prevent any single governor from becoming too powerful, he reduced the size of existing provinces and created new, smaller ones. This divide and conquer within his own administration ensured that all lines of authority flowed directly back to the throne. This centralization was critical for managing an empire that would soon stretch across the entire Near East. He was essentially building a highly efficient top-down command structure, removing any potential challenges to his absolute authority. Equally revolutionary were his military reforms. Tiglath-Pileser III transformed the Assyrian army from a largely conscripted force, dependent on levies from various regions, into a professional standing army composed of highly trained and disciplined soldiers. This professional corps, loyal only to the king, was augmented by specialized units, including expert charioteers, cavalry, archers, and siege engineers. He also introduced innovative tactics and refined siege warfare to an art form, making almost any fortified city vulnerable. His army was not merely an instrument of war. It was an efficient, mobile engine of conquest, capable of sustained campaigns far from home. This dedication to a professional military, constantly drilled and equipped with the latest technology, was a game-changer for ancient warfare. With these internal reforms in place, Tiglath-Pileser III embarked on a staggering series of military campaigns that would solidify Assyria's grip on the Near East. His primary focus was to reclaim and expand Assyrian control over the entire Levant, including the wealthy city-states of Syria, Phoenicia, and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. He relentlessly campaigned against the Aramean states, finally breaking their power and effectively integrating their territories directly into the Assyrian provincial system. This was a brutal but effective method of turning persistent adversaries into taxable subjects. He also famously intervened in the internal affairs of the Kingdom of Israel, responding to an appeal from King Ahaz of Judah. He captured Damascus in 732 BCE, ending the long-standing Aramean kingdom, and deported much of its population, a policy he widely adopted. This mass deportation was not just a punitive measure. It was a core imperial strategy. By forcibly relocating large segments of conquered populations to distant parts of the empire, Tiglath-Pileser III aimed to break ethnic and political loyalties, dilute potential rebellions, and provide labor for his massive state projects. It was a cruel but remarkably effective way to create a more unified, docile imperial workforce and eliminate local resistance. Historians still argue whether this was the most efficient way to manage diverse populations, but its impact on the demographic landscape of the ancient Near East was profound. To the south, he asserted Assyrian dominance over Babylonia, even going so far as to take the throne of Babylon himself as Pulu, after defeating local Chaldean rulers. This was a pragmatic move to secure the most prestigious city in Mesopotamia, ensuring its resources and preventing it from becoming a base for anti-Assyrian sentiment. He skillfully balanced direct rule with strategic alliances and vassal treaties, adapting his approach to the specific circumstances of each conquered region. By the end of his reign, Tiglath-Pileser III had forged an empire of unprecedented size and sophistication. His administrative and military reforms provided the blueprint for all subsequent Neo-Assyrian kings, ensuring that the empire could sustain its vast conquests. He had taken a kingdom on the brink of another decline and transformed it into the dominant, ruthless, and highly centralized power of the ancient world. His legacy was an empire built to last, founded on efficiency, terror, and relentless expansion. With Tiglath-Pileser III having fundamentally reshaped Assyria into a lean, mean imperial machine, one might expect a smooth succession and continued, predictable expansion. But history, much like a good ancient drama, loves a plot twist. After his reign, an enigmatic figure rose to power, a man whose legitimacy was initially questionable, but whose military genius and ambition would solidify the Neo-Assyrian Empire's unprecedented dominance. This was Sargon II, who reigned from 722 to 705 BCE, and his story is one of usurpation, relentless campaigning, and the further entrenchment of Assyria's iron grip on the Near East. If Tiglath-Pileser III was the brilliant architect, Sargon II was the tireless builder, adding new imposing wings to an already terrifying structure. The very beginning of Sargon II's reign is shrouded in a bit of mystery, prompting historians to still argue whether he was truly a usurper or a legitimate heir. His name, Sharu-Kinu, means the legitimate king. A rather telling choice, isn't it, for someone whose claim to the throne was dubious? It suggests a need to constantly assert his right to rule. It's a bit like someone repeatedly telling you how trustworthy they are. You can't help but wonder why they feel the need to emphasize it so much. Regardless of his lineage, Sargon II quickly demonstrated that he possessed the ruthless ambition and military prowess necessary to command the Neo-Assyrian Empire. His first major challenge, and arguably his most famous historical feat, was the final conquest of the Kingdom of Israel. Remember how Tiglath-Pileser III had already significantly weakened Israel, taking territory and deporting some of its population. Sargon II completed the job. In 722 BCE, shortly after his ascension, he besieged and captured Samaria, the capital of Israel, after a 3-year siege that had begun under his predecessor. This wasn't just another conquest. It marked the definitive end of the northern kingdom of Israel as an independent entity. He famously deported tens of thousands of Israelites, scattering them across the Assyrian Empire, a continuation and intensification of Tiglath-Pileser III's deportation policy. This act, the lost 10 tribes of Israel, had a profound and lasting impact on the history of the ancient Near East and is a central event in biblical history. It effectively erased a nation from the map, demonstrating the terrifying finality of Assyrian conquest. Sargon II's reign was defined by almost non-stop military campaigns, a testament to the fact that maintaining a vast empire required constant vigilance and the crushing of countless rebellions. The territories conquered by his predecessors, particularly in the Levant and Babylonia, were always looking for an opportunity to rebel, often forming alliances with Egypt or other regional powers. Sargon II was constantly on the move, asserting Assyrian authority. He campaigned extensively against the rising power of Urartu to the north, inflicting significant defeats and plundering their lands. These victories were crucial for securing Assyria's northern flank and maintaining access to vital resources. His conflicts with Babylonia were also a major feature of his reign. The Chaldeans, an Aramean group settled in southern Mesopotamia, frequently challenged Assyrian rule over Babylon, often with the support of Elam to the east. Sargon II faced the formidable Merodach-Baladan II, a Chaldean chief who managed to seize the throne of Babylon. It took Sargon II several years and a major military effort to finally defeat Merodach-Baladan and reclaim Babylon, a city whose prestige was paramount to Assyrian imperial legitimacy. In 710 BCE, Sargon triumphantly entered Babylon, taking the throne himself, once again asserting Assyrian direct rule over the ancient city. This constant struggle for Babylon highlights its strategic and symbolic importance. It was a prize worth fighting for again and again. Like Ashurnasirpal II, Sargon II also embarked on an ambitious building project, constructing a magnificent new capital city called Dur-Sharrukin, modern-day Khorsabad, meaning Fortress of Sargon. This colossal city, designed to be a grand testament to his power and legitimacy, featured a massive palace adorned with intricate reliefs depicting his military victories and the submission of conquered peoples. It was a city built on a scale to rival Kalhu and Nineveh, showcasing the immense wealth and resources now at the Assyrian Empire's disposal. The construction of a new capital was a common tactic for Assyrian kings to solidify their reign and showcase their power. A kind of ancient urban rebranding. Sargon II's reign ended somewhat abruptly during a campaign in Anatolia, a fate that perhaps underscores the inherent dangers of constant warfare, even for the most powerful monarchs. He was killed in battle, a rare and potentially destabilizing event for an Assyrian king. Despite this, he left behind an empire that was larger, more organized, and more dominant than ever before. He continued the administrative and military reforms of Tiglath-Pileser III, solidifying the bureaucratic and professional military structures that allowed Assyria to maintain control over its vast territories. Sargon II truly hammered home the message that the Neo-Assyrian Empire was not just powerful, but almost unyielding in its quest for absolute supremacy. Following the sudden battlefield demise of Sargon II, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, now a truly colossal entity, faced the ultimate test of succession. Would it fracture, as so many ancient empires did when their formidable founder departed? Not on the watch of his son Sennacherib, who reigned from 705 to 681 BCE. If Sargon II was the tireless builder, Sennacherib was the ruthless pragmatist, an engineering marvel in kingly form, whose reign would be defined by a series of monumental campaigns and, most notoriously, his relentless obsession with Babylon, turning it into his eternal nemesis. Imagine a ruler so utterly consumed by one particular rivalry that he would literally flatten a millennia-old city just to make a point. Sennacherib's ascension was relatively smooth, a testament to the strong administrative and military structures put in place by Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II. However, he inherited an empire that, while vast, was constantly plagued by rebellions, particularly in the ever-restive lands of Babylonia and the Levant. The moment a powerful Assyrian king died, subject peoples would often see it as an opportunity to throw off the yoke. This meant Sennacherib's reign, much like his predecessors, was a relentless cycle of punitive campaigns. His relationship with Babylon was the central, defining feature of his rule. Babylon, the ancient, prestigious city, had a knack for attracting anti-Assyrian sentiment and serving as a base for rebellious movements, often supported by the powerful kingdom of Elam to the east. Sennacherib initially tried various approaches, including appointing his own son as king of Babylon and attempting to rule through proxies. But time and again, Babylon would rebel, often rallying behind various Chaldean chiefs like the persistent Merodach-Baladan II. Remember him from Sargon II's reign. This constant defiance clearly infuriated Sennacherib to his very core. It was a relationship that festered, escalating from mere rivalry to outright hatred. The culmination of this bitter conflict came in 689 BCE. After yet another Babylonian rebellion, Sennacherib decided to make an example, a horrifyingly definitive one. He launched a full-scale assault, captured the city, and then proceeded to systematically destroy Babylon. This was no mere sacking. It was an act of utter annihilation. He explicitly recorded his actions, tearing down its walls, demolishing its temples and palaces, diverting the Euphrates River to flood the site, turning the once great city into a swamp. His stated goal was to erase Babylon from existence, to make it as if it had never been. This was an act of unprecedented brutality and sacrilege, as Babylon was a sacred city even to many Assyrians. Historians still argue whether this extreme act of vengeance was truly rational, or if it was driven by pure, unadulterated fury. But its shockwaves certainly echoed throughout the ancient world. It's a bit like someone blowing up their ex's entire neighborhood because they broke up. Extreme, to say the least. Beyond Babylon, Sennacherib also famously campaigned in the Levant, most notably against the kingdom of Judah and its king Hezekiah. In 701 BCE, he launched a massive invasion, conquering many fortified cities in Judah and besieging Jerusalem itself. The biblical account, as well as Sennacherib's own annals, recorded on the famous Sennacherib prism, describe the siege. While Sennacherib boasts of trapping Hezekiah like a caged bird in Jerusalem, he never explicitly claims to have captured the city. The biblical narrative suggests a miraculous deliverance, while the Assyrian account implies a heavy tribute payment and perhaps a withdrawal due to disease or other factors. Historians still debate the precise outcome and reasons for the Assyrian withdrawal from Jerusalem, but it remains one of the most intriguing historical puzzles of the period, an open scholarly debate where two powerful narratives meet, but don't quite align perfectly. Sennacherib was also a monumental builder and an extraordinary engineer, driven by a passion for his chosen capital, Nineveh. He transformed Nineveh into a city of unparalleled grandeur, a true imperial metropolis. He undertook massive public works projects, including expanding its walls, digging vast irrigation canals to bring water from distant mountains, and creating magnificent parks and gardens. Some speculate these might have been the inspiration for the later Hanging Gardens of Babylon. His palace in Nineveh, known as the Palace Without Rival, was a testament to his immense wealth and architectural ambition. adorned with thousands of feet of carved reliefs depicting his military campaigns and daily life. He dedicated himself to making Nineveh the undisputed center of the world, perhaps as a direct counterpoint to his destruction of Babylon. Sennacherib's reign ended, much like his father's, in violence. He was assassinated by one of his own sons, likely due to internal court intrigues and possibly related to his controversial decision to destroy Babylon, which many viewed as an affront to the gods and ancient tradition. His death plunged Assyria into another, albeit brief, succession crisis. Despite his brutal end, Sennacherib left an empire at its territorial peak, managed by a sophisticated administration and defended by an incredibly efficient military, a testament to his iron will and unshakable resolve, even if it was sometimes tainted by extreme acts of vengeance. The dramatic assassination of Sennacherib, ending his reign in a pool of palace intrigue, once again threw the mighty Assyrian Empire into a moment of perilous uncertainty. Yet, from the inevitable jostling for power, a new king, Esarhaddon, emerged to reclaim stability and, remarkably, undertake an act that defied his father's most infamous deed, the rebuilding of Babylon. His reign from 681 to 616 BCE marks a period of consolidation, strategic expansion into a new theater, and a fascinating attempt to reconcile the wounds of the past, even while projecting an image of unrelenting power. It's like a corporate successor deciding to apologize for a predecessor's famously disastrous business decision, while simultaneously planning a hostile takeover of a new market. Esarhaddon's path to the throne was not straightforward. As a younger son, he was designated as heir by Sennacherib, a decision that deeply angered his older brothers. This led to a brief but intense civil war immediately following Sennacherib's murder. Esarhaddon, with the support of the army, successfully defeated his rivals, executed them, and solidified his claim. This experience, no doubt, taught him the fragility of power and the importance of internal stability. His most astonishing and symbolically significant act was his decision to rebuild Babylon. Remember how his father, Sennacherib, had utterly annihilated the city, turning it into a watery ruin. Esarhaddon, whether out of genuine piety, shrewd political calculation, or both, embarked on a massive project to restore Babylon to its former glory. He attributed the destruction to divine wrath, framing it as a temporary punishment for Babylon's sins, rather than merely his father's vengeful act. He brought back the sacred cult statue of Marduk, which Sennacherib had removed to Ashur, and painstakingly rebuilt the city's temples, walls, and palaces, meticulously adhering to ancient rituals and traditions. This act was a masterstroke. It appeased the powerful Babylonian priesthood, garnered the loyalty of the surviving Babylonian population, and presented Esarhaddon as a righteous, conciliatory ruler, unlike his vengeful father. Historians still argue whether this was a true change of heart or simply a pragmatic recognition that a prosperous, loyal Babylon was more valuable than a destroyed one. But its impact was undeniable. It was a sophisticated piece of imperial statecraft, far more nuanced than simple brute force. While engaging in this act of restorative diplomacy, Esarhaddon was anything but weak. He relentlessly pursued Assyrian imperial ambitions on all fronts. His most significant military achievement was the conquest of Egypt, a long-held dream of Assyrian kings. Egypt, with its immense wealth and strategic location, had always been a rival power, often supporting rebellions in the Levant against Assyrian rule. In 671 BCE, after several preparatory campaigns, Esarhaddon launched a full-scale invasion, defeating the Kushite pharaoh Taharqa and capturing the Egyptian capital of Memphis. This was an astonishing feat, extending the Assyrian Empire to its greatest geographical extent, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Nile Delta. Imagine the sheer logistical challenge of moving such an army across deserts to conquer a distant, powerful land. It cemented Assyria's position as the true superpower of the ancient world. To the north, Esarhaddon continued the long-standing struggle against Urartu, inflicting further defeats and ensuring that this northern rival remained in check. He also campaigned against nomadic tribes to the east and south, securing trade routes and preventing incursions into Assyrian territory. His rule was characterized by constant military vigilance, ensuring that none of the subject states could challenge Assyrian supremacy. Esarhaddon was also known for his strong belief in omens and divination. He surrounded himself with scholars and diviners, consulting them constantly before making major decisions. This reliance on supernatural guidance reflects a deeper anxiety within the empire, perhaps a lingering fear from his father's violent end, or simply a common practice of kings in an unpredictable world. He was meticulous in documenting these consultations, providing a fascinating glimpse into the spiritual life of an Assyrian monarch. It reminds us that even the most powerful rulers were not immune to the anxieties and superstitions of their time, and indeed often embraced them. Despite his relatively short reign compared to some of his predecessors, Esarhaddon left a profound mark. He skillfully navigated a perilous succession, undertook the audacious rebuilding of Babylon, and achieved the unprecedented conquest of Egypt, bringing the entire Fertile Crescent under Assyrian dominion. He showed that Assyria could be both brutally effective in conquest and remarkably shrewd in its governance, willing to make concessions if it served the larger imperial purpose. His reign set the stage for the empire's final glorious and tragically brief chapter under his chosen successor. With the vast Neo-Assyrian Empire now stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Nile Delta, the stage was set for its final great flourish, a period that would combine immense power with an unexpected dedication to intellectual pursuits. This era was dominated by Ashurnasirpal, who reigned from 616 to approximately 631 BCE. Often considered the last great king of Assyria, his reign is renowned not only for its continued military triumphs, but, perhaps even more famously, for his unparalleled passion for knowledge and the creation of his magnificent royal library. If his predecessors were conquerors of lands, Ashurbanipal was also a conqueror of knowledge, an intellectual giant on a throne of iron. Ashurbanipal's ascension was carefully orchestrated by his father, Esarhaddon, who, fearing another succession crisis like his own, had made his sons swear solemn oaths to support Ashurbanipal. This foresight paid off, as Ashurbanipal inherited a relatively stable, albeit vast and demanding empire. He was unique among Assyrian kings in that he boasted of his literacy and scholarly pursuits, a stark contrast to the rough-and-tumble warrior image often projected by his predecessors. He claimed he could read and write in Sumerian and Akkadian, and that he was trained in all aspects of scribal art and wisdom. This intellectual curiosity would lead to one of his greatest enduring legacies. While his scholarly interests were notable, Ashurbanipal was, first and foremost, an Assyrian king, meaning his reign was still characterized by relentless military campaigns to maintain and expand the empire. He inherited the ongoing challenge of managing the newly conquered Egypt. Although Esarhaddon had subdued it, Egypt remained restive. Ashurbanipal had to launch several major campaigns to suppress rebellions in Egypt, definitively defeating the Kushite pharaoh Tantamani and even sacking the ancient city of Thebes, Noamon, in Assyrian inscriptions. This destruction of Thebes was another demonstration of Assyria's willingness to inflict brutal punishment on rebellious territories, and it ensured, for a time, Assyrian control over Egypt's immense wealth and resources. However, the most significant and protracted conflict of Ashurbanipal's reign was against his own brother, Shamash-Shumukin, whom Esarhaddon had appointed as king of Babylon. Remember how Esarhaddon had painstakingly rebuilt Babylon and placed his son there? Well, Shamash-Shumukin, despite his oaths, eventually tired of being a mere vassal, and with the support of Elam, the Chaldeans, and various Aramean and Arab tribes, launched a massive rebellion against his brother. This civil war, which lasted for several years, roughly 650–648 BCE, was devastating for the empire, draining immense resources and manpower. It was a brutal struggle, brother against brother, culminating in Ashurbanipal's siege of Babylon. The city once again suffered terribly, eventually falling after a prolonged siege that led to widespread famine and cannibalism. Shamash-Shumukin perished in the flames of his palace. This conflict highlights the constant internal fragility of the empire, even at its peak. It truly was a hydra, with heads often turning on each other. Historians still argue whether the cost of suppressing this rebellion fatally weakened Assyria in the long run. Having crushed his brother's rebellion, Ashurbanipal then turned his full fury on Elam, the eastern kingdom that had consistently supported Babylonian insurrections. He launched a series of devastating campaigns into Elam, culminating in the complete destruction of its capital, Susa, in 647 BCE. He boasts of sacking its temples, carrying off its gods, and sowing its fields with salt. This act effectively removed Elam as a major geopolitical player, eliminating a long-standing rival and securing Assyria's eastern flank. It was a victory of immense proportions, but also one that likely contributed to the overextension of Assyrian power. Amidst all this conquest and brutal suppression, Ashurbanipal pursued his true passion, the collection of knowledge. He sent scribes and agents across his empire to gather every available text, particularly ancient Mesopotamian literary, religious, and scientific works. He established the famed library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, which housed tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets. This wasn't just a collection. It was a systematic effort to preserve the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamia. We owe much of our knowledge of ancient Mesopotamian literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, and countless medical, mathematical, and astronomical texts to Ashurbanipal's foresight. He was, in effect, the ancient world's most dedicated librarian and archivist, creating a repository of knowledge that would far outlast his empire. It's a truly amazing fact that a king known for his brutality was also responsible for preserving so much of human history. By the end of his reign, Ashurbanipal had maintained the empire at its territorial peak, suppressing all major rebellions and defeating powerful rivals. He ensured Assyria remained the undisputed hegemon of the Near East. However, the immense costs of his campaigns, particularly the brutal civil war, had undoubtedly weakened the empire's foundations, even if it wasn't immediately apparent. The seeds of its final dramatic collapse had inadvertently been sown, despite the grandeur and intellectual brilliance of its last great king. After the grand yet costly reign of Ashurbanipal, a subtle but undeniable shift began to grip the mighty Neo-Assyrian Empire. The seemingly invincible juggernaut that had dominated the Near East for centuries started to show cracks, entering its twilight period. It's like watching a perfectly crafted, formidable fortress that, after centuries of holding strong, begins to crumble from within, brick by imperceptible brick. The immediate years following Ashurbanipal's death, circa 631 BCE, are shrouded in some historical obscurity. But the trend is clear. The empire was overstretched, exhausted, and internally weakened, setting the stage for its dramatic and surprisingly swift collapse. The primary reason for this decline wasn't necessarily a single catastrophic military defeat on the scale of, say, a modern world war. Instead, it was a confluence of factors, a slow bleed that drained the empire's vitality. Firstly, the sheer cost of constant warfare was immense. Ashurbanipal's lengthy reign, particularly the devastating civil war against his brother, and the relentless campaigns against Elam and Egypt, had depleted Assyria's manpower and treasury. Imagine running a massive corporation that is constantly expanding and fighting hostile takeovers. Eventually, even the richest company will start to feel the financial strain. The constant need for new recruits, the maintenance of a vast professional army, and the rebuilding efforts after rebellions placed an unsustainable burden on the Assyrian heartland. Secondly, the policy of mass deportations, while effective in breaking resistance, also had a long-term destabilizing effect. It created a complex tapestry of diverse displaced populations across the empire, many of whom harbored deep resentment towards their Assyrian overlords. These disparate groups, forcibly removed from their homelands, often lacked genuine loyalty to the Assyrian state. While individually they might not pose a threat, collectively they represented a massive potential for unrest, ready to ignite given the slightest opportunity. It was a population controlled by fear, not allegiance, and fear can only hold things together for so long. Thirdly, there was a noticeable weakening of central authority after Ashurbanipal. His successors, Ashur-etil-ilani, Sinshu-Lishir, a usurper, and Sinsha-Ishkun, struggled to maintain the absolute control that had characterized the reigns of Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal himself. There were internal power struggles and short, tumultuous reigns, suggesting a lack of a strong unifying hand at the helm. When the top brass are constantly fighting amongst themselves, it inevitably trickles down and affects the entire organization's morale and efficiency. This internal instability presented golden opportunities for long-suppressed peoples and external rivals to launch their own bids for independence or dominance. Simultaneously, new powers were rising on Assyria's periphery, eager to fill any power vacuum. The most significant of these were the Medes to the east and the Neo-Babylonians, or Chaldeans, to the south. The Medes, an Indo-European people who had coalesced into a powerful kingdom in ancient Iran, had been largely kept in check by Ashurbanipal. But after his death, they grew rapidly in strength and ambition under their leader, Cyaxares. The Neo-Babylonians, under the dynamic leadership of Nabopolassar, were the spiritual and political successors to the powerful southern Mesopotamian traditions that had always resented Assyrian dominance. Nabopolassar, a Chaldean general, seized control of Babylon during Assyria's internal squabbles. Setting up an independent Babylonian kingdom that would become Assyria's deadliest adversary, the relationship with Egypt too shifted. While Ashurbanipal had decisively defeated them, the 26th dynasty of Egypt, the Site dynasty, began to reassert its independence and rebuild its power. They even, ironically, sometimes acted as reluctant allies to Assyria in the empire's final days, seeing the rising power of Babylon as a greater threat. It's a strange turn of events when your former oppressor becomes the lesser of two evils. The Assyrians, despite their weakening, were still immensely powerful and held vast territories. They were not simply overrun in a single stroke. This twilight period was characterized by a series of desperate attempts by Assyrian kings to hold back the rising tide of their enemies, fighting on multiple fronts against increasingly coordinated opposition. The brutal efficiency that had built the empire was now turned inward, desperately trying to suppress constant revolts and fend off encroaching armies. The proud proclamations of endless victories slowly faded from the royal inscriptions, replaced by pleas to the gods and records of difficult, grinding defensive wars. The fear that Assyria had so effectively projected outwards now began to creep into its own heartland. The stage was tragically set for the final violent act of the greatest empire the Near East had ever seen. The once invincible fortress, however grand, was now teetering on the edge of oblivion, a victim of its own colossal ambitions and the relentless march of history. As the twilight deepened over the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the cracks that had begun to appear under Ashurbanipal's successors widened into gaping fissures. This wasn't a slow, graceful descent, but a desperate, brutal, and ultimately futile final stand against a converging storm of enemies. Imagine a cornered, wounded lion, still fearsome but increasingly overwhelmed by a pack of hungry, coordinated predators. The last kings of Assyria, Sinsharishkun and Ashur-uballit II, found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, trying to preserve what their ancestors had built, but against odds that were becoming insurmountable. The main protagonists in Assyria's demise were the resurgent Neo-Babylonian Empire under the relentless Nabopolassar and the rising power of the Medes under Cyaxares. These two formidable forces, once suppressed or contained by Assyrian might, now formed a powerful alliance, bound by a common desire to dismantle the very empire that had terrorized them for centuries. It's a classic case of former enemies making common cause against a greater threat, an ancient version of "the enemy of my enemy is my friend." Historians still argue about the exact terms of their alliance, but the combined military might they could bring to bear was unprecedented. The fighting began in earnest in the years following Ashurbanipal's death, roughly from the 620s BCE. Nabopolassar, seizing the opportunity presented by Assyria's internal squabbles and the instability following Sin-Shah-Ishkun's ascension, cemented his control over Babylonia. He then launched a series of aggressive campaigns northwards, pushing into the traditional Assyrian heartland. The Assyrian armies, despite their past reputation, found themselves struggling to contain the determined Babylonian advance. Their resources were stretched. Their best commanders might have been lost in earlier campaigns, and the morale of a long-suffering army was likely waning. Simultaneously, the Medes, under Cyaxares, were expanding their influence from the east. They were skilled horsemen and fierce warriors, bringing a new dynamic to the battlefield. They initially targeted Assyrian territories in the north and east, strategically cutting off vital resources and outflanking Assyrian defenses. The Assyrians were effectively being attacked from two major directions, forcing them to divide their already strained forces. It's like trying to fight a war on two fronts when you only have enough soldiers for one. One of the key turning points came around 610 BCE with the fall of Ashur, the ancient religious and historical capital of Assyria. This was not just a strategic loss, it was a devastating symbolic blow. Ashur, the city dedicated to the patron god of Assyria, had been the heart of their identity for over 1,000 years. Its capture, likely by the Medes, sent shockwaves through the empire. Imagine the Vatican being sacked in a modern context. It would be a profound spiritual and psychological trauma. The fact that the Assyrians couldn't defend their most sacred city signaled that the end was truly nigh. The last Assyrian king, Sin-Shah-Ishkun, desperately tried to rally his forces, but his efforts were constantly hampered by mutinies, desertions, and the overwhelming numerical superiority of his enemies. Even his capital, Nineveh, the magnificent city built by Sennacherib and beautified by Ashurbanipal, became a focal point of the final struggle. Assyrian generals and officials, sensing the inevitable, began to defect or simply abandon their posts. The empire that had been built on fear was now crumbling, because that fear was no longer enough to bind its disparate parts. The final battles were fought with desperate ferocity. The Assyrian army, once the most feared in the world, still possessed some of its old fighting spirit, but it was a shadow of its former self. They were fighting not for conquest, but for sheer survival. Cities fell one by one, their garrisons overwhelmed, their populations often suffering the terrible fate that Assyria had so frequently inflicted upon others. There's a cruel irony in that, isn't there? The architects of terror now experienced the very terror they had perfected. This period of the final stand was characterized by the collapse of central administration the dwindling of resources, and the growing sense of hopelessness among the Assyrian elite. The grand palaces and magnificent temples, once symbols of invincibility, now stood as vulnerable targets. The wealth accumulated over centuries of conquest was being plundered, and the very existence of the Assyrian people was at stake. The once mighty lion was not just wounded, it was bleeding out, slowly, agonizingly, as its former prey closed in for the kill. The stage was set for the empire's dramatic, definitive fall, a catastrophic end to 1,000 years of dominance. The desperate, drawn-out struggle of Assyria's final stand culminated in an event that sent reverberations throughout the ancient world: the fall of Nineveh. This wasn't just the capture of a city, it was the symbolic death knell of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, an empire that had dominated the Near East for centuries. Imagine, if you will, a seemingly impregnable fortress, the heart of an empire built on fear and iron, finally succumbing to the relentless assault of its combined enemies. It was a spectacle of destruction, a moment of profound vengeance, and a turning point in ancient history, much like the fall of Rome to later generations. The siege of Nineveh, the magnificent capital that Sennacherib had transformed and Ashurbanipal had cherished, began in 612 BCE. The combined forces of the Neo-Babylonians under Nabopolassar and the Medes under Cyaxares, along with Scythian and Cimmerian allies, converged on the city. Nineveh was incredibly well fortified, boasting massive walls and a vast moat, designed to withstand any siege. The Assyrians, despite their dwindling resources, put up a fierce resistance, relying on their famed military engineering and the inherent strength of their defenses. This wasn't a quick collapse. It was a grueling, protracted struggle, a testament to the city's formidable defenses and the Assyrians' stubborn determination. However, the besiegers were equally determined, and their combined numbers and resources were overwhelming. One of the key factors in the fall of Nineveh, as described in later historical accounts like those by Diodorus Siculus, though written centuries later and often mixing fact with legend, was a massive flood of the Tigris River. Historians still argue about the extent to which this was a providential event or a clever military tactic, perhaps involving the diversion of water or exploiting a natural flood season. But legend has it that the flood caused a breach in the city's seemingly unbreachable walls, creating a weakness that the besiegers exploited with devastating effect. Imagine the despair as the city's primary defense was undermined by an act of nature, or by an enemy who knew how to turn nature against them. Once the breach was made, or the defenses finally overwhelmed, the Allied forces poured into the city. The ensuing chaos and destruction were immense. The Assyrian king, Sinshar-Ishkun, is believed to have perished in the conflagration, possibly taking his own life rather than being captured. The palaces, temples, and the magnificent library of Ashurbanipal, despite its resilient cuneiform tablets, suffered extensive damage. The city, once a symbol of Assyrian grandeur, was subjected to a thorough sacking. The wealth accumulated over centuries of conquest was plundered, and its inhabitants suffered the same fate that Assyrians had so often meted out to others: slaughter, enslavement, or forced deportation. It was a brutal reversal of fortune, a truly historic moment of retribution. The destruction of Nineveh was celebrated with immense relief and triumph by Assyria's enemies. The prophet Nahum, for instance, in the Hebrew Bible, jubilantly describes the city's ruin, depicting it as a just punishment for its cruelty and oppression. This widespread joy among the surrounding nations underscores the sheer terror and resentment Assyria had inspired throughout its centuries of dominance. The empire that had been built on fear and the relentless projection of power was now gone, and a palpable sense of liberation swept across the Near East. While Nineveh fell, the Assyrian story wasn't immediately over. A remnant of the Assyrian army, led by Ashur-Uballit II, managed to escape the carnage and retreat westward to the city of Haran. There, with some support from Egypt, he attempted to establish a final Assyrian holdout and rally support. He briefly proclaimed himself king, desperately clinging to the fragments of a shattered empire. However, this was a last, futile gasp. The combined might of the Babylonians and Medes pursued him, and Haran fell around 609 BCE, marking the definitive end of any organized Assyrian political entity. Ashur-Uballit II likely vanished into obscurity or perished, the last king of a once mighty empire. The fall of Nineveh and the subsequent collapse of Haran marked the end of an independent Assyrian state. The scale of the destruction at Nineveh was so complete that, for centuries, its location was largely forgotten, reduced to legendary status, only to be rediscovered much later by archaeologists. The empire that had seemed invincible simply vanished from the political map, leaving behind monumental ruins and the echoes of its terrifying legacy. It was a dramatic and conclusive end to an empire that had reshaped the ancient world, proving that even the most formidable power can ultimately be undone by a combination of overextension, internal weakness, and the coordinated wrath of its many enemies. The dust settled over the ruins of Nineveh and Haran, and with it, the political entity known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire simply ceased to exist. Yet, the disappearance of a dominant state never truly means the disappearance of its impact. The aftermath of Assyria's collapse was not an empty void, but rather a dynamic period of power shifts, as former vassals and new forces rushed in to fill the enormous vacuum, giving rise to powerful successor states. It's like a colossal tree falling in a dense forest. Suddenly, sunlight reaches the forest floor, allowing new saplings to sprout and flourish where they once lived in shadow. The immediate beneficiaries of Assyria's demise were predictably the architects of its downfall, the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the Median Empire. The Neo-Babylonians, under the brilliant generalship and statesmanship of Nabopolassar and his son, the even more famous Nebuchadnezzar II, inherited the lion's share of Assyria's western territories, including Mesopotamia, Syria, and the Levant. Nebuchadnezzar II, in particular, would lead Babylon to a new golden age, transforming it into one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world, complete with the legendary Ishtar Gate and the Hanging Gardens, though historians still argue about the true nature and existence of the latter. His reign saw the final subjugation of the Kingdom of Judah, culminating in the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian captivity, a direct continuation of Assyrian-style imperial control and deportation. Babylon, once Assyria's bitter enemy and victim, now became the new superpower, ruling over many of the same peoples and territories with a similar, albeit perhaps less overtly brutal, imperial style. It's a fascinating irony that the very methods and structures of empire perfected by Assyria were readily adopted by its conquerors. To the east, the Median Empire under Cyaxares, and later his son Astyages, absorbed Assyria's northern and eastern territories, including parts of modern-day Iran, eastern Anatolia, and northern Mesopotamia. The Medes, who had previously been a collection of tribes, rapidly consolidated into a powerful and expansive empire. While their historical records are much scarcer than those of Babylon, their influence was undeniable, controlling vast swathes of territory that had once belonged to Assyria. They became a formidable power in their own right, eventually setting the stage for the rise of their close relatives, the Persians. Beyond these two major powers, other smaller regional kingdoms also experienced a resurgence or emerged in the power vacuum. Egypt, under its Scythe dynasty, had already begun to reassert its independence even before Assyria's final collapse. With Assyria gone, Egypt was free to pursue its own imperial ambitions in the Levant, often clashing with the rising Neo-Babylonian power for control of the region, notably at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. This re-emergence of Egypt as a major player highlights the dynamic and interconnected nature of ancient Near Eastern geopolitics. The various peoples who had been subjected to Assyrian rule, the Arameans, the Phoenicians, the various tribes of Anatolia and the Levant, found themselves under new overlords, but their lives were still largely defined by imperial control. The harsh reality was that the age of empires was far from over. It had merely changed hands. The methods of imperial governance, of tribute collection, and of military control that Assyria had innovated and perfected continued, albeit under different names. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of this aftermath is the fate of the Assyrian people themselves. While their empire was gone, the people did not simply vanish. Many were killed or enslaved during the conquests, but a significant population remained in what had been the Assyrian heartland. They continued to live in their villages and towns, albeit under Babylonian or Median rule. Their language, Aramaic, which had gradually replaced Akkadian as the lingua franca of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, continued to be spoken. Their religious identity, centered on the god Ashur, persisted. They continued to exist as a distinct ethnic and cultural group, albeit without their own state for many centuries. This resilience of the Assyrian people, enduring centuries of foreign rule, is a testament to the strength of their cultural identity, even after their political power evaporated. The fall of Assyria fundamentally reshaped the political map of the Near East. It marked the definitive end of the Bronze Age power structures and ushered in a new era dominated by the Neo-Babylonian and Median empires, soon to be overshadowed by the meteoric rise of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The world moved on, but the shadow of Assyria's immense power and its brutal legacy lingered, shaping the strategies and fears of the empires that followed. Even though the thunderous roar of the Assyrian lion had been silenced, and its magnificent cities lay in ruins, the empire's influence did not simply vanish into the desert sands. Far from it. The legacy and lasting impact of the Assyrian Empire are profound, weaving themselves into the very fabric of subsequent civilizations and shaping the course of history in ways that are still evident today. It's like a colossal river that, even after it dries up, leaves behind fertile deposits that nourish future growth, or carves canyons that define the landscape for millennia. Perhaps the most immediate and tangible legacy was in imperial administration and military organization. The Assyrians, particularly from Tiglath-Pileser III onwards, pioneered sophisticated methods of managing vast territories. Their provincial system, with centrally appointed governors, their efficient tax collection methods, their extensive road networks, and their systematic use of a professional standing army served as blueprints for subsequent empires. The Neo-Babylonians, and most notably the Achaemenid Persian Empire, directly adopted and refined many of these Assyrian administrative practices. When you think of the vast, interconnected Persian Empire, remember that many of the tools they used to govern were first forged in the fires of Assyrian innovation. It's a bit like an ancient operating system that, though eventually superseded, provided the foundational code for all future versions. The Assyrians also had a significant impact on military technology and tactics. Their siege warfare, with its reliance on battering rams, mobile towers, and extensive sapping techniques, set new standards for warfare in the ancient world. Their use of cavalry and chariots, combined with disciplined infantry formations, made their army a truly professional and fearsome force. Many of these innovations were absorbed and adapted by later armies, directly influencing military thought for centuries. The very concept of a professional standing army, always ready for war, owes a debt to Assyrian precedents. Culturally, despite their reputation for brutality, the Assyrians were also patrons of the arts and sciences, and their empire served as a crucible for the exchange of ideas. The library of Ashurbanipal, as we discussed, preserved an immense repository of Mesopotamian literature, myth, history, and scientific texts that would otherwise be lost to us. This act of preservation ensured that the intellectual heritage of Sumer and Akkad, and Assyria itself, continued to influence later cultures. Without Ashurbanipal's meticulous collection, our understanding of ancient Mesopotamia would be far poorer. Think of it as a massive, ancient hard drive that saved countless files for future generations. Furthermore, the Aramaic language, which became the lingua franca of the Neo-Assyrian Empire due to deportations and trade, continued to spread and became the common language of administration and commerce across the Near East for many centuries after Assyria's fall. It was the language spoken by Jesus, and the language in which significant portions of the Bible and Talmud were written. This linguistic legacy is a direct result of Assyrian imperial policy, demonstrating how deeply their rule permeated the daily lives of millions. The sheer psychological impact of the Assyrian Empire was immense. Their reputation for terror, for ruthless efficiency, and for the systematic destruction of resistance left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the ancient world. Prophetic books in the Hebrew Bible frequently refer to Assyria as a divine instrument of punishment, a terrifying and overwhelming force. Even centuries later, the memory of Assyrian might would serve as a cautionary tale or a standard against which new empires measured their own power. The very word Assyrian became synonymous with imperial power and often with overwhelming force. Paradoxically, Assyria's very brutality also led to its downfall. The intense hatred and fear it generated fostered powerful coalitions among its enemies, uniting them against a common foe. This blowback effect is a crucial lesson from Assyrian history. An empire built solely on terror is ultimately unsustainable, as the desire for vengeance and freedom will eventually overwhelm even the most formidable power. It's a sobering thought, really. How much of history is just one power creating the conditions for its own destruction? So while the physical empire dissolved, its shadow stretched far and wide. Its innovations in governance, military strategy, language, and even its cultural preservation efforts continue to shape the empires that followed. The legacy of Assyria isn't just a collection of ruins and royal annals. It's a testament to the enduring impact of a truly transformative, albeit often terrifying force in human history. The echoes of its power and the lessons learned from its rise and fall continue to resonate long after its final kings vanished from the scene. The magnificent ruins of Nineveh, once the undisputed heart of the greatest empire the Near East had ever known, lay buried for centuries, almost entirely forgotten by the wider world. It's a truly strange fact to consider that an empire so dominant, so grand, could literally vanish from human memory, reduced to whispers and biblical allusions. But then, in the 19th century, a new chapter began. The rediscovery of Assyria and the painstaking process of piecing together its astonishing story lead into our rich and often evolving modern understanding. Imagine archaeologists, armed with shovels and dreams, unearthing entire cities, bringing a lost civilization back to vivid life, piece by painstaking piece. The first major breakthroughs came in the mid-19th century. Driven by curiosity and biblical interest, European adventurers and scholars, most notably Paul-Émile Botta and Austin Henry Layard, began excavations at sites in northern Mesopotamia. Botta, the French consul in Mosul, started digging at Khorsabad in 1843, soon realizing he had unearthed Dur-Sharrukin, the magnificent capital city of Sargon II. Imagine the thrill of discovering an entire, untouched royal palace filled with colossal winged bulls and intricate reliefs buried under centuries of earth. It was an archaeological sensation. Not long after, the British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard began his own epical excavations at Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, the capital of Ashurnasirpal II and Shalmaneser III, in 1845, and then moved to Koyunjik, which was soon identified as the site of ancient Nineveh. Layard's discoveries were even more spectacular. He unearthed the vast palaces of Ashurnasirpal II, Shalmaneser III, and most famously, the colossal palace without rival of Sennacherib at Nineveh. His finds included breathtaking Lamassu figures, miles of carved reliefs depicting battles, hunts, and daily life, and most incredibly, the remains of Ashurbanipal's great royal library. The discovery of the library, in particular, was a game changer. It consisted of tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets containing not just royal annals and administrative records, but also vast collections of Mesopotamian literature, religious texts, scientific treatises, and dictionaries. This wasn't just finding old bones. It was discovering the very voice of an ancient civilization. However, these tablets were written in Akkadian cuneiform, a script and language that were largely unknown to the modern world. This is where the painstaking work of decipherment began, a true intellectual detective story. Scholars like Henry Rawlinson played a crucial role working on the Behistun inscription, a trilingual inscription in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian Akkadian, much like the Rosetta Stone for Egyptian hieroglyphs. By the 1850s, the Akkadian language and cuneiform script were largely deciphered, unlocking the vast archives of Assyrian history. Imagine the moment when those ancient tablets, silent for 2.5 millennia, suddenly began to speak, revealing the tales of mighty kings, brutal conquests, and sophisticated societies. It's like finding a secret diary from someone who lived thousands of years ago, giving you their innermost thoughts. The rediscovery of Assyria fundamentally changed our understanding of ancient history. Before these excavations, much of what was known about Assyria came from the Hebrew Bible, which, while valuable, presented a largely hostile and limited perspective. Suddenly, a wealth of primary source material emerged, allowing scholars to reconstruct a much fuller, more nuanced, and often more terrifying picture of the empire from its own perspective. We learned about their sophisticated administration, their engineering prowess, their religious beliefs, and the chilling details of their military campaigns directly from the mouths of their kings. Our modern understanding of Assyria continues to evolve. New archaeological discoveries are still being made, and existing texts are constantly reinterpreted. Scholars today grapple with complex questions. How did their ideology of absolute kingship truly function? What was the daily life like for the average Assyrian citizen or the countless deportees? Historians still debate the precise reasons for the empire's ultimate collapse, weighing factors like overextension, internal dissent, climate change, and the unique combination of external threats. There's still so much to learn, so many more pieces of the puzzle to fit together. The legacy of Assyria, now illuminated by modern archaeology and scholarship, stands as a powerful testament to human ambition, ingenuity, and frankly, brutality. It reminds us of the cycles of rise and fall that characterize human history, and how even the most dominant powers can disappear, only to be resurrected by the patient work of scholars and the silent endurance of artifacts. The story of Assyria, once buried, is now vibrantly alive, continually shaping our understanding of the ancient world. So, as the echoes of ancient Nineveh fade into the quiet of your room, I hope you found a new appreciation for this truly incredible, terrifying, and endlessly fascinating empire. The Assyrians were not just a footnote in history, they were a colossal force that shaped the world around them in indelible ways, from the very structures of empire to the languages spoken across the Near East. Their story is a reminder that even the most powerful can fall, and that history, like a vast desert, holds countless buried secrets waiting to be unearthed. As you drift off, perhaps you'll ponder how much of our own world, our own ways of organizing power and society, still carries the faint imprint of those ancient iron-willed kings. May your dreams be filled with fascinating facts and serene landscapes, far removed from the clamor of ancient battlefields and the dusty whispers of forgotten empires.